What?
All right, well, welcome to the first edition of ConCon.
It's good to be here.
I'm DR.
I'm Ben.
We're
Bender.
We are Bender. We have been really interested in consciousness for a very long time. And I was trying to remember today what the first times that we talked about this. It has to go back, like, pretty early in our friendship. Probably like early days of Burning Man. And
well, I'm wondering the first day we met, if it ever came up. I think we talked mostly about Mormonism and stuff. At that house
had
party.
That black IPA, the Black of Mormon IPA.
Yeah, but I don't know if consciousness came up there, but it definitely came up like
pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe when we stopped binge drinking so much.
Probably. Yeah, I think for me it was like starting to read, because it was when I got to Pittsburgh that I basically started reading. I don't think I ever really read books like of general interest in science and stuff before that, and it felt like, it was coming out of my Mormonism cocoon, and I kind of like was reading like The Selfish Gene and The God Delusion, and I'm trying to think of some of those early ones. This book by Karen Armstrong, A Case for God and the Evolution of God, and it really like gave me I should be leaning in a little bit more, right?
I mean, you sound good in
okay.
my ears.
It gave me for the first time the confidence and the idea that like these problems that I had considered to be unsolvable, or these things that I had thought about in my kind of Mormon youth that were like, oh, you can't answer that question. Oh yeah, you can answer a lot of those questions. Like, I found really satisfactory answers. And so I think on that chase, actually I remember what it was. I think it was, yes, I know exactly what it was. I read Waking Up by Sam Harris. And there's a piece in that book where he says, and that's like about the nature of consciousness, which we know is like a total mystery and no one understands it. And that really like got my hackles up around the religion thing of people being like, oh, you can't understand it. It's a total mystery. And I think that's one of the biggest things to me that's like, fuck you. Let's dig into it. Like, I kind of refuse to think that certain things are not understandable. And I think that actually kicked off that. It was the first time I'd seen somebody say something like that I had been trusting and respecting and reading the book. And I'm like, wait, I need to dig into this more.
Yeah, actually, that brings up some memories of my own past as a youngin'. I think that the cogito ergo sum, whenever I learned that in school, that sort of was kind of like an eye-opening thing. And when you think about like, I think therefore I am, if that's sort of your baseline, right? I remember I was actually in a either Sunday school or like a youth group program, and I was telling people, I was like, how do you know what you're not looking at even exists? Like, basically what's behind you. And they're like, well, you just turn around and you look. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you're not seeing behind you the other way. How do you know that disappears from existence? And I'm sitting there like blowing these kids' mind, and the pastor walks by, and he was like, Ben, that's dangerous existentialism or something like that. And I was like, well, I didn't even know that word. But then I was like, what? And I think he was like tongue in cheek a little bit.
Yeah.
But then of course that sort of put me into like a little bit of a rabbit hole. Like, what is existentialism? And then, yeah, I sort of pursuing those kinds of ideas, you very quickly lead to like pursuit of consciousness sort of mysteries.
Yeah, kind of like all roads somehow end up leading you back there, if you start pushing hard enough. And I think, we're gearing up to go to this Science of Consciousness conference in Sicily in May. And one of the speakers is Roger Penrose, who's like a physicist. And I think it's just like in, what's his name, Crick from Watson and Crick, that found DNA, and then they're like, oh, well, let's solve consciousness now. We figured out this thing. It just seems like everybody kind of ends up focusing on it if they keep going hard enough. If you keep asking the right questions and you don't end up getting afraid of them.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if this is super related, but there was and maybe this is like I don't know if this is a true story, but there's a. We've got a cat in the camera. Yeah, he's definitely in frame. There's a story like that some Stanford professor, when they were building a robot, like said to one of his grad students, okay, like solve computer vision this summer as your internship project, right? Because they were that was like the first sort of golden age of AI period where like the sky was the limit and they were making a lot of progress. And obviously like it took like another 50 years to solve computer vision. And in some ways we haven't solved it, but it is kind of funny. It's like Crick was like, okay, we did this DNA thing. Like, okay, let's knock out consciousness. But then of course, that's kind of the final frontier in a way.
So what do you think are, when you start to, this happens to me a lot where someone, I'll start bringing up random stories about whatever and people are like, wait, why are you interested in this? What's interesting to you? What do you think are like the first questions or the first, I remember some of the, where I was going with this is like, I was trying to think of some of the first things that intrigued me as well. So let me circle back to that question so I don't forget this, but which is I remember us very vividly at this party and you're talking to me about the hemispheric neglect and people drawing the clock faces and the split brain studies. And I think like Gazzaniga, who did those split brain studies, he wrote a book called The Consciousness Instinct. It's actually one of my favorites. But those studies, it's like, you show someone something that they can't see with their confabulating mind, with the mind that like creates their narrative, and they don't see it, but they act as though they did. And then the story that you said, and so I knew about those, and that was already kind of compelling. And then I remember you drawing a picture for me of a clock with all of the numbers on one side of the circle. And then they're like, oh yeah, and wait, why did you draw it like that? And it's like, oh, it's just like a weird clock. Like they made up the story that the clock is supposed to be like that, even though obviously the reason why they're drawing it is because they have hemispheric neglect. And that I think was a big tip off of like, wait a minute, we're generating these narratives around about ourselves that are not at all truthful, but are very convenient to us in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. This reminds me of the Annika Harris book, where she basically spends, I feel like my memory of the book is she spends like the majority of the book saying what consciousness isn't, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, well, this thing you think it is, well, it's not, because there's these XYZ examples, where you sort of remove a variable and like there's still consciousness, so it's consciousness is not doing that thing, and it sort of squeezes what consciousness does to essentially nothing, and then she says, well, panpsychism or something like that. Yeah. But I think, I don't know how like deep we want to dive in this topic, but like I think this confabulator idea, where the confabulator basically confabulates that it is consciousness, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? When in fact it's not. It might be something more like base emotions and the sort of feeling of being from your brainstem, whereas your confabulator is sort of in the front of your brain, right? So, but it's saying, hey, I'm the conscious guy. I'm the pilot, right? Yeah. I'm the thing narrating your internal monologues. But it's not, right? And well, okay, so I'm developing this visual where you have a cat on a Roomba. Have I told you this?
No, but I love this. I mean, we had that whole conscious Roomba debate. Which
yeah.
So I like describing that to people.
Okay, so cool. You have this really complicated Roomba, let's say, and it's making all these sort of, let's call them intuitive decisions, right? It doesn't have sort of like, maybe its planning capabilities aren't very long term. Maybe they are. But it's doing this sort of very intuitive, holistic kind of behavior. And then you have a cat sitting on top of it, riding the Roomba. And the cat is the confabulator. The cat's basically like when the Roomba, goes down the hallway instead of into the bathroom and says, oh, the Roomba doesn't need to go to the bathroom because the bathroom's already clean. So, and it's creating these stories. And stories often make sense insofar as they're predictive.
Yeah.
Right? So it says, well, it cleaned that, so it's going to go down the hallway. Maybe that is a good story to tell, but the Roomba has no idea of that. Maybe it's sort of following some very basic pre-programmed, like it's been too long, and it's not like actually saying, oh, well, that's clean or dirty. And I think the issue is most of what we do is Roomba. And we're the confabulator is basically trying to paint a cohesive story of this sort of intuitive organism that's mostly operating sort of subconsciously, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes very difficult to self-inspect, right, your own conscious brain, because the sort of verbal part of you is just this cat on top of the room.
Yeah.
Right.
And I love that. That's actually very reminiscent of the elephant in the rider thing from the Jonathan Haidt stuff that I really like. Yeah, where there's like this this thing that's moving below you, and you have this perspective, but like a lot of that's happening outside of your control. And it's not just a matter, I think it's not just a matter of perspective, that like, oh, you're not sitting in the right chair to see this. It's also that you are being actively prevented by the narratives around you from like diving too deep into that, because it's like, oh, it's not great for your genes to know that what you're doing in life is like not that important, like you need to be really invested in that Roomba situation.
Yeah, I also think there's some sort of actionable things. If this is your mental model of sort of like how the confabulator works, right? It sort of, to me, downplays the role of sort of like the forefront part of your brain, like self-discipline and willpower, right? And we can see this in population studies. People can't adhere to diets, right? Or they'll crash diet and then they'll yo-yo and be at a higher set point weight. I think part of this is that we overestimate our ability of the cat to direct the Roomba, right? Because that's what that is, right?
Yeah.
In reality, the room is going to do what the room is going to do, and the cat is going to always say, well, I drew the clock like this, because yada, 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 when the Roomba actually has this like interesting neurological issue.
Yeah.
And this seems to me that like, in terms of like thinking about consciousness this way, it kind of points to systems where the Roomba does the thing it does naturally, right? I just feel like, I see this in my own life with the sort of the glucose monitor that I'm wearing.
Yeah.
Once you get your diet right so that you don't spike, you don't crave food. You don't crave like sugary snacks and stuff. So it's not even like a willpower thing to not eat them. And I think it's always a losing battle to have this sort of conscious will to prevent you from doing this thing that you don't want to do. You don't want to do, your confabulator, the cat doesn't want to do, and the Roomba is always going to win, right? So if you get the Roomba right, then the cat has an easy job saying, well, oh yeah, you just don't eat sugary snacks all the time. It's like, well, yeah, okay, that's what the cat says.
Well, I think, an interesting, it's so interesting at the conference to see all these narrative arcs that people are interested in. So there's like the psychedelics piece, there's the neuroscience piece, and there's the spirituality piece. And it's a lot of like meditation and Eastern practice, which is really about what? Like not fighting, not trying to be the cat with a story, but trying to like be the Roomba, like like recognizing what your body wants and where it wants to go, and not trying to like confabulate too hard, and that there's a lot of peace and connection there.
By the way, if I could invoke Wampak, I can hear him saying the cat on the Roomba doesn't really, we're not really addressing qualia, right, with the hard problem, which is a false dichotomy.
The qualia cherry's been popped.
But like the confabulator, why does it feel like anything to be a cat on a Roomba in the first place? It's sort of almost like a separate question in a sense. Well, I agree. Maybe it's not, maybe it is, but it's definitely like, if we just think about everything but the quality aspect of consciousness, I think the cat on the Roomba sort of works for these types of things. But I mean, there's definitely also downward pressure, right? There are situations in your life where I feel like, and maybe this is a lie, you're confabulating, but you can think of something in the front of your brain. I'm going to stop smoking. Maybe you felt that. Maybe you didn't think it up here. This could always be back to the Roomba cat thing. And then you cause the Roomba to never go into the bathroom again. Yeah. The bathroom is the smoking in this analogy, right? Maybe it seems like there's some downward.
Well, I like to think about this as like, you see people that get into toxic relationships or addiction, or they sort of follow these patterns. And I like to think of, a spaceship kind of like threading a needle through a bunch of planets that all have their gravitational pull. And you go through the path and you end up, you get sucked over this other direction. You're like, wait, what the fuck? How did I end on this planet? And then you start over and you're like, okay, wait, I don't want to do that. And then you have to start doing the math of how the gravitate, because once you get into that weave, the gravitational pulls are going to take you wherever they're going to take you. And it's like, you don't learn how to not be an alcoholic by not having the third drink. You learn how to not do it by not having the first drink, and sort of building patterns at the level of, at a further remove from the moment where you actually don't have that much decision-making power, where the Roomba's, you're in the Roomba's going to clean this whole room. Sorry. If you can keep the Roomba out of that room, you close the door or something, now all of a sudden you have like more control. I think a really interesting example of the cat Roomba thing is like having conversations with people about gambling, Like if you go, maybe we were together when this happened. I think it was with my brother, and we went to the casino, and it was like, I'm just such an analytical minded person, and I'm like, oh yeah, you just wait. So like you're playing blackjack, and you just put the same amount on every hand, and like eventually, you lose a little bit, but sometimes you win a little bit. It's like, okay. And then I was like, is that all you do? I'm just like naively trying to figure it out. And it's like, well, but when you feel it, you should put a little bit more down, And like the statistic part of my brain is like, that's just horseshit. There's no way that you can like feel it but you create such a strong narrative about what it meant to win or lose. Like, oh, and like when somebody, almost every time if you're playing craps and somebody like didn't put money on 8 or whatever, they're like, oh, I really knew that 8 was going to hit. It's like, no, you didn't. Like, like that's not a real, but you like create that story so strongly, even though like by law, objectively, calculated externally, this is happening randomly, and yet you just like, oh wait, I can, there's something in that randomness that is for me.
Yeah, actually, so the gambling thing's interesting. I think, again, the Roomba is probably pretty like dopamine motivated, right? Very basic novelty, expectation mismatch, sort of motivational behavior. And I'm reminded there was like some guy, I think on Twitch, a gambler who like scammed a bunch of other Twitch streamers out of money because he had a gambling addiction. And someone confronted him again on Twitch and was like talking him through his addiction. He's like, yeah, I know I'm a piece of shit. But then he's like, but here, this is how it is. Like, let's say you're gambling and you're winning. Well, you can't stop if you're winning. And he's like, but then if you start losing, well, you can't stop if you're losing because you need to stop while you're winning, right? And I'm listening to this, and I'm like, I don't think this guy realizes that logic chain means you never stop gambling.
You never stop gambling, yeah.
And I realized
well, you stop when you run out of money. It's the only reason, yeah.
And I think that's actually an interesting sort of like mind trick that the cat can play on the Roomba in some sense. And I actually see this in sort of other kind of addictive type behaviors where I sort of like will rationalize an addictive type behavior in the same way, where it's like on the sort of positive side, well, I can't stop doing it because of this reason. But if it goes south, I'm like, well, I can't stop either because of this reason. It's like I think it's a very common calculus that people have in addictive behavior, right?
And I think this is part of what makes therapy ultimately therapeutic and healing is like you actually can develop an embodied sense of the toxicity of that narrative. You're like, oh, like you explain this to yourself, to a therapist, and they're like, do you see why this would be like a non-productive? And you're like, oh my God, like, do you see why when you date these people or you like drink this way, like it never goes the way you want? And, people can know that at some level, but when they get a deep embodied sense of it, then they're like, oh, I see that lesson. And I think this is where, back to the consciousness conference thing of like the psychedelics thing is people are like, oh, they treat psychedelics with addiction. And I think really all that's happening, it's not like, cleansing your synapses or what. I guess Ibogaine maybe does that a little bit, but it's resetting your narrative around these things. You're seeing it you're capable of seeing something from an outside perspective that you couldn't see before in such a way that you like just intuitively don't steer the Roomba in that room again.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's hard to tease apart which is the cat, which is the Roomba.
Maybe our logo for the thing is going to have to be a cat on a Roomba.
So, like, I remember, I think it's a Michael Pollan thing where he said, like, the things that sort of the enlightened thoughts that you have on psychedelics are actually kind of like no shit sort of thoughts. But the fact is that these thoughts get deeply internalized. So when you're like, you tell someone who's smoking, yeah, smoking kills you. Yeah, I know, smoking kills me. That's the confabulator. That's the cat saying, I know smoking kills me. But when you take a psychedelic and you go, oh, smoking fucking kills me. Yeah. Right? That is somehow Roomba up and then cat down, right? Which actually is not getting to the Roomba. And I find that very interesting.
I've had multiple like life things that I was wrestling with, and a psychedelic experience. I remember I was dating this girl, and I was like kind of trying to decide whether I wanted to continue the relationship, and I was out with friends, and I was just thinking about it, and I saw a vision, and it was like these like wooden blocks. It's kind of nonsensical, but it was sort of like of this like physical thing in the same way like you open your eyes in a room and there's no way to convince you that the floor is not the floor and the wall is not the wall, and it's just like that's the reality that you inhabit. And I think in the same way it's like visualizing this problem in a visual way and seeing these pieces. And it was like, basically I saw me and a bunch of friends and like activities, and there were all these wooden pieces that fit together really well. And this person was like made out of a different material, and it did not fit in this context, And it's like, that's not true, but it was like a way of like surfacing for me that reality that like I could definitely sense internally, which is like, this person did not fit in my life.
Well, yeah. I've read something that the crosstalk in the brain, like if you crosstalk from the emotional center to your visual cortex, you'll literally see your emotions, right? And that can manifest, with this sort of types of visions, I think that you had perhaps. And so you're literally seeing
one's
vibes,
part of your brain's. Yeah.
Right? You're seeing your emotional vibes. And maybe, we're such visual creatures, right? I feel like there's something very powerful to that, like if you could on command, for example, just visualize your emotions, I think people would be, better at knowing their internal state.
One of the, is it Lisa Barrett something that wrote the book about emotions? I think in her book she talks about how like basically one of the best ways to get better at emotions is to just have more vocabulary for them. Like not, it's like, oh, I feel bad or I feel good. It's like, well, wait, describe that more. And like the more definition that you're able to provide to those, like the better you're able to like process them and recognize them. Well, okay.
By the way, I want to throw out one spicy take. I think GPT-4 is only Roomba.
Yeah. No, you said that the other day, and I'm like totally sold on this now, because at the first, initially, our friend Wanpa is very into this book, The Master and His Emissary. Have you read it?
I did buy The Matter with Things. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
The huge tome.
Yeah, it's intense, but it's very much like left brain, right brain. And his main thesis of The Master and His Emissary is that like, our culture is now overly reliant on the left brain, and that we're this like super analytical society, and we're kind of out of balance. And so my natural inclination was to think of AI as actually just an extension of the left brain. It's like, oh, it's doing all this hardcore analytical stuff, but actually some of the best stuff that it's doing is like creative work. And to your point, it's like, is it confabulating? Is it creating a narrative? Is it analyzing itself? No, it's just like thinking about the next word. It's very Zen. It's very much that embodied thing where it's like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing profound things. I think that's...
By the way,
cool.
I'm reminded, so this idea got scooped a little bit. There was a paper that came out probably 2 days ago. I think it was a Microsoft research paper. They had internal early access to GPT-4, and they made it wasn't left brain, right brain, but they made the connection to Daniel Kahneman's like type 1, type 2 thinking, thinking fast and slow. And they said that it's basically only a fast thinker. Yeah. Right? And this is very similar to left brain,
interesting.
Right brain. And
I've heard, are people still into the Kahneman stuff? Because I've heard that some people are like, this is garbage science. And then he won like a Nobel Prize. And I've just recently heard some, like, I thought contrary opinions about it, but I don't really remember where.
I don't know.
I mean, intuitively, it sounds great to me. So.
I mean, he's still like in the public eye and writing books and stuff.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's like debunked, but people were sort of like, it was like overly simplistic. I don't know. Maybe it's like the left brain, right brain thing that people kind of got queasy about, but then they're like, with like McGilchrist, they're coming back around on it. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about, I think maybe the next thing down the ladder of my interest in, which is very tied into all the stuff we talked about, which is the quote that kind of resonated for me for a couple years related to consciousness. This was that we are the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. You remember me talking about this a lot? And I think that it came from this article that I read from the creator of True Detective. And I was like, the first season, and I was like obsessed with that show, like Woody Harrelson, Matthew McConaughey. And he was talking about the arc of these characters. And he said, these people are these two main gentlemen are like no different in the end than they were at the beginning. The only thing really different about them is that the story that they tell themselves about themselves. And I just like, found that. And that's been super true in my life of these, transition points from being super religious or whatever. And it's like, oh, I have a different narrative, and that's my entire life. And I think it ties into all the confabulation and, and then, I think from there, my interest is turned into where those stories come from and how they're shared collectively among groups, because it's not just an individual story. It's like how your story fits within a collective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably an evolutionary advantage to having a consistent self-narrative for what you're doing and your goals and so forth, right? You could move through life as a Roomba, but I think that cat gives you benefits, right? Having an internally somewhat consistent story, right? There's definitely cognitive dissonance that people live with, but having that sort of as a negative pressure to try to have some, I mean, this is what causes you to have like consistent morals. This is what causes groups to be swayed, right, by things like propaganda, right? Because it's sort of, I think it sort of becomes larger than a single organism, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's something about the narrative that's larger than the here and now of that organism, right? And then, you know, as you sort of mentioned, you apply that to a group, and now you have sort of shared like values and things like that that are also somewhat internally consistent or externally consistent. So
yeah, well, I'm kind of surprised. Well, we can talk more about this maybe at another one, but like I'm surprised at the people that don't come to this conference, and I'm curious what conferences they go to, like Solms and Graziano and some of these guys that we're really into. But another big piece of this puzzle to me, I feel like so much of the focus is on the individual. And it's like, what does the strand of DNA look like? What are the neural correlates of consciousness of this mind? Whereas like to me, I think the functional level of consciousness is at a community level. And it's like, what is the purpose of that, and how does it work within this group? And, you know, I've always thought that it's like, well, how did humans get so smart? It's like, why did we need this? Well, I think it's because we are the most economically diverse species. You know, we do different things to provide for ourselves. And suddenly, if you're going to be, you know, a carpenter or a beekeeper or a, you know, a soldier or a slave, you have different things that you need to optimize for. And likewise, the partner selection has to also do that math. Like, oh, well, should I get with the carpenter or the soldier or this guy? You know, it's not like picking out a mate who's a chimp or a gorilla who just like, you just pick the biggest, strongest one, you know? What about, well, how do I do with it in this very complex environment where it could be any number of things that sort of impart status and impart like potential success to my offspring?
I think you can also drill down the other way. I mean, like you could say that the human being as an organism is economically diverse, right? We have different types of cells and tons of bacteria, and they're somehow working together to cause us to be this big sack of meat.
Well, it's sort of like, so you have like these like cellular economies that are kind of like collaborating, and now through, you know, our language, our culture, whatever, we're becoming those ecosystems as well, as knit together as, you know, any kind of set of cells. Like very hard to exist in this world as a human totally by yourself, mentally if not physically.
Yeah, I mean, I think what becomes intriguing again is the qualia part, right? Like, so it seems like there's a single head, right, to the economy that is all the different cells in our body, and there's a single narrative, so to speak. It makes me think, in a, you know, sort of drawing from like Solms and Graziano and so forth, like you have the cat, maybe it's doing a very important job in that it's sort of summarizing all the feelings of all the parts of you, right? I don't know for...
Well, it's summarizing the parts of the feelings that are convenient to your like biological success, right? There's lots of things that it's not summarizing.
Yes. Yeah. But also like that doesn't seem to exist for society. Like if society as a whole is another big Roomba, like where's the cat on top of there? I mean, maybe it is the ethereal zeitgeist of, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's you see things like the news cycle or like, you know, Twitter trends or whatever. Like there's
Facebook feed.
Facebook feed. There's less embodiment, but yet like it's so interesting now that like, you know, all of our friends probably have different news sources, and people are reading Reddit or people are on TikTok or whatever, and yet like we get together and we talk about the same stories, and everyone's like, oh, I know about this and I know about this, and so there's kind of this collective. Well, I probably talked to you about this analogy that I really like, of thinking of like our culture and even language as like the blockchain, and like you have these ideas and you have these thoughts, but like they're not really real until you've committed them to this like social blockchain. It's like, hey Ben, did you hear about this thing? And then you're like, oh yeah, I did. Oh, I heard that's bullshit. Oh, ditch that block from the blockchain. Or it's like, oh yeah, that's amazing, and also this, right? And now we're kind of like creating this shared reality. And I feel like those shared realities kind of work within a context of a single relationship, within a family, within a church group, within a larger culture. And so, maybe that decentralized kind of model of, think of Wikipedia, for example. Okay, that's a shared sense of reality at some level. Maybe there's contentious parts, but there's also like uncontentious parts that we just like go to Wikipedia and we're like, this is the truth about this country,
But does society have any qualia at the aggregate level? I don't think there's any mechanistic way it's possible. No. So I think this is the thing with consciousness. There's the definition's too broad. I think in some senses you could claim that the population level zeitgeist is conscious, but I don't think it has qualia.
Yeah. Do you think qualia is like the essence of consciousness, though? I mean, this
is
our big debate, right?
I think that you can get very far with that, never talking about qualia.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of like a thorn in the side. I mean, this is why I think some people, I guess they're called like illusionists, right? Who think that the qualia problem is basically like not even a well-formed problem. But I'm kind of in the camp that, again, it's sort of like a mashup of Graziano and Solms, where if I can like sort of mischaracterize their positions a little bit, probably, I think Graziano is very concerned with sort of the mechanistic.
You just bumped it.
Bump. The mechanistic sort of like what has to be true for you to be convinced that you have qualia.
Yeah.
Right? There has to be a part in your brain, right? If you're a sort of a materialist, there is a part in your brain convincing you that qualia exists, right? You have that opinion. That opinion originates in your neurons. Like there's somewhere in the brain you hold that opinion. It can't be any other way unless you invoke sort of supernatural forces, right? But that's only part of the story. I think the other part of the story is Solms. Like, why does it feel so disembodied or ethereal or so impossible to describe? And I think maybe it's because it's so far down in our brains, like in our brainstem. And I think he has like pretty convincing reasons to think that this ineffable quality, these qualia, are extremely primitive parts of the brain. And what we're seeing is, I think the interplay, if I merge these two ideas together, the interplay of that very, very deep, like super far, old evolutionary part of our brain with the confabulator, the cat that's sort of wrestling with those base signals and interpreting them sort of.
Which is very obviously the newest part, right?
Yeah. And which says to me, so I mean, I think metacogniting on like these very old evolutionary signals is kind of like how qualia arises.
So I think Solms drew a lot of his inspiration from this guy Jaak Pansep, he wrote a textbook called Affective Neuroscience, and he's like all about emotions. And he wrote this book called Archaeology of the Mind that I read recently that I thought was really great. I think the Affective Neuroscience was a textbook, and he basically just turned that into a popular science book. And my favorite quote from that book, because he's talking about like, and Solms always says like, say what you want about emotions, but they're designed to be felt. It's like, this is where consciousness comes from, because like there's no other purpose for an emotion other than be felt. And Pansep's term was that he said, emotions are ancestral memories. They're memories baked into our DNA that like promoted survival, whether that's anxiety or like, oh my God, there's a snake and you react, or whatever, like you're feeling something that's trying to make you react faster than you could think about it, because every animal below us has had to do that. And so qualia, I think, just makes sense as that's what that is. Like you're observing all these things, you're getting all this data so that you're prepared to have those ancestral memories like assert themselves. And I think that the whole AI thing has shed, to just do a terrible job of describing it, right? In AI, you're training these models and it's creating all these like weightings of different things that is then it's using to determine whether a photo is a cat or not, right? And I think that the qualia could basically just be thought of as some of those parameters. It's like you need all those parameters to then be able to surface up.
Okay, so I think you hit on something really interesting. I think the quote was something like, emotions.
We should define qualia probably.
Emotions are there to be felt or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's doing the feeling? So I think that one issue with most of these conversations is that, are you speaking from the Roomba's perspective, or are you speaking from the cat's perspective? Going back, right? So
yeah, that's a good point.
So I have a contention with one of Solm's arguments that kids who literally have no brains but the brainstem are conscious. I think they're feeling things in the sense that the Roomba is feeling things.
Yeah.
But I think that...
They're not Graziano consciousness.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Which means I think they're sort of like, their consciousness is much like a fish, which can have sort of negative and positive stimuli that it heads towards or, against. And I think without any sort of metacognition on top of those emotions, those feelings, I think there's not a substantial sort of consciousness to speak of.
Yeah.
Right? If a tree falls in the forest, no one hears it.
Well, they're not participants in social consciousness and in connection. Like, we can't assess their consciousness at a certain level because they can't talk to us and engage with us in the way that we normally assess our own. Right?
I think it's more like they and their cat. They don't have a cat on the room, so they can't have an opinion about their feelings.
Yes.
And I think to me that is sort of the most emblematic portion of what I would call consciousness, or even like.
That's the part that I care about.
Qualia without metacognitive sort of framework on top of that is sort of like just like the Roomba hits its bump sensor and turns, right? So there's not like a cat on top saying, "Oh, that hurt me," or whatever. Like, and so I feel like it's kind of like becomes more mechanistic, like just sort of like an automaton of some sort. But I sort of draw the line for consciousness. This also sort of like, allows me to eat fish, right? without any ethical problems. At needing some sort of metacognitive bit that then is looking. And by the way, this also pertains to GPT-4, where I think once we start either giving it the ability to sort of in a more integrated fashion look at what it's outputting, instead of just like auto-regressively bit by bit.
Yeah.
If it sort of has another system that can explain why it's doing what it's doing or review what it's doing in a sort of slower loop, I think then we suddenly might find that it has emergent opinions about whether or not it's feeling things.
Yeah.
Right? Because the feeling is a really powerful story. And the funny thing is it might actually be not feeling things, right? But it might be convinced that it is because it's a very convenient way to explain how it's behaving.
Yeah.
Because it's not evolving like we evolved, right? It is next word predicting to the max. But I think it's very unclear. Yeah, maybe this is getting too into the weeds on this subject, but like it's very unclear to me, and I think to most everyone, how emergence works. And if you look at, let's say, like something really simple like cellular automata, like Stephen Wolfram stuff, you can have very, very simple rules and incredibly emergent complex patterns. And there's like, the theory says there's no way to predict that pattern except for just crunching the cellular automata. Yeah. And so whether or not the base rules...
This was like that Veritasium video that we watched, I think, about this. He has one. Yeah, I think you can have these things that, there's no way to predict them. Yeah.
So like, for example, if next word prediction is sort of the base rule, it's very hard to predict all the emergent phenomena. Or if like gene selection is the base rule in randomness, there's no way to predict that would, humans would spring forth with consciousness from that very base thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious at what point...
And that may have never been the outcome, right? Had there not been like the dinosaurs got destroyed or whatever. That was probably a fairly stable state. Like there's no reason for T-Rexes necessarily to have become conscious,
Yeah. So I guess I'm bringing this up to say that like, I think it's interesting. Next word prediction might be all it takes with a suitably powerful computer for the emergence of even things that sort of approximate how feelings work for us, or feelings might be an artifact only of biological evolution.
Yeah.
But there could still be sort of the analog that it invents if it's a convenient story for itself to be able to explain itself, which it also has benefits for it to do next word prediction even better. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like ultimately you have to get smarter and smarter and smarter to do very simple tasks, and then that intelligence is super useful for other things, right? I mean, it's like so many evolutionary adaptations like feathers and wings and stuff were very obviously around for a long time before they were used for what they eventually became used for. And I'm sure similarly, like we just got really smart to do certain kinds of activities, and then that turned into this like ability to metacognate and to like have conversations and, you know, think about consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, this subject alone, I think, could be an entire podcast.
Yeah.
But, I mean, because I sort of have opinions that there's very basic issues with randomness and combinatorics, where there's inevitable structure emergence with very, very simple feedback mechanisms, like very slight feedback mechanisms.
You know, I had a kind of a deep thought about this stuff in recently, like, you know, another big passion that's super related is like biology and evolution and how animals have evolved. And, you know, in a species, there's behavior that makes it look like they're trying to like conform as much as possible. It's like, oh yeah, I'm trying to find the best possible version of the sparrow, and the female sparrow is looking for the best male sparrow, and likewise. And yet, very obviously, evolution is designed for actually diversity. It's designed to maximize diversity as much as possible. And then you have these like species that look like they're containing that diversity, but then it's just spilling over into like endless stuff. And I think that like we talked about this thing of like the lottery ticket, like every person who's seeing the color red, for example, or every person who's like, you know, remembering the state Arkansas is doing that in a different way. And those different paths actually provide more and more and more opportunities for diversity, such that like somebody, the first time they think of Arkansas, like it inspires them to write a song, and another person, it inspires them to do something else. And you kind of have all this like potentially diverse output and positive energy that's coming from a very limited set of, you know, inputs in the world.
Yeah, we're sort of throwing around terms that we haven't defined. You mentioned we haven't really defined qualia. I think the lottery ticket hypothesis is another sort of deep dive that if we throw around as a term, people are probably like, what's going on? So I don't know if we want to go into that, but...
do you want to try and define qualia?
I mean, the standard definition, I guess, is sort of the ineffable. It's hard to. I want to use the word feeling because I've been polluted by Solms, but you know, it's that sort of ineffable quality of experiential substance, right?
Yeah.
So the redness of an apple, the pain of a pinprick, you know, this sort of thing is.
I heard a really good. There's in that. Is AI conscious kind of talk that I was listening to that I was telling you about. One of the guys talked about like, oh, you know, there's this debate. It's like, oh, these large language models, they don't see anything. So do they even know what these words mean? And they actually had this congenitally blind guy that they were talking to, or well, there was a video. They didn't show the video, but they were referencing it. And they're like, what does transparent mean? And he's like, oh yeah, it means like, you can see through it, like and then it's like, oh, also it's like this person who's never seen, you know, he's like married this color scientist. So there's this famous thought experiment about qualia, which is like you have this color science. No, is that what they call her? Color science. She's a scientist, Mary, who like lived in this black and white room, and she's never seen any color. And she walks outside and she sees a red apple for the first time. Does she learn any new information? Like, what is it? What is that? Right? And I think that I thought that example was interesting because it was like this guy has never seen something that is transparent, and yet he does functionally know what it is, right? I mean, the color red might be a harder one, right, for him, but he probably knows objects that are red. He's like, oh, this flag is these red colors, and an apple is red. You know, you learn those things semantically, even if you don't experience them in the outer world.
I mean, yeah, I kind of wish we had a dissenting opinion here because I'm on board, but it's, I think, a really interesting topic. So I guess I can bring up a couple of interesting things that I've heard or read about GPT-4. If, you know, someone did an experiment, maybe it wasn't even on GPT-4, but they basically looked at the sort of, I think it was the embeddings for all the color words, right? And they found that actually the geometry of that sort of subspace of embeddings corresponds actually to the geometry of color space in the real world with respect to like either the sort of like psychological perception of color, but maybe it's even the physics. But like that to me is really interesting. I wish I could remember the thing you could Google to find this Wikipedia page, but there was an old conjecture that basically all verbal meaning is totally defined just by sort of the statistical relationships of words with other words. And that would basically mean like, you don't need a dictionary, right? A dictionary is one way to define words, but really it's always going to be incomplete. The complete definition is all text or sort of verbal thought that's ever been thought,
Yeah.
all text that's ever been written. You look at sort of co-occurrence statistics, and that is the perfect definition of a word. Dog, every time it's ever been used in relation to all the words that it's around that can text, that is actually the actual definition of dog, at least insofar as it's been defined by society using that word. And therefore, like a dictionary definition is not going to capture the full thing, but the full thing, in fact, is captured in these co-occurrence frequencies. And then sort of the strong argument of that is that that's all you need, right? You actually don't need to see a dog.
Because the thing you're trying to do is live in semantic space.
Yeah, exactly. And so maybe insofar as like the sort of limits of what verbal knowledge can confer, you're done, right? So in that sense, GPT-4 has sort of almost perfected that type of semantic knowledge, right, with respect to language. And maybe, there's sort of other experiments where you describe rooms and walking through like buildings and stuff, and then you can have it, like it can plot things using like programming languages. So you can say like in this, esoteric LaTeX, like diagrammatic language, like write the code for what you think this room layout is, and it will do it correctly. So there's, in some sense, an isomorphism there between some sort of spatial visual knowledge that it is encoding somehow in itself, at least to the point where it can programmatically write a program to output the correct graphics.
Yeah.
Right? Or like, there's, I think the Microsoft paper that I referenced that had early access to GPT-4, they kept asking it as it was being trained to draw a unicorn in that language. And it got better and better to the point where it drew a really good unicorn, right? So
just like in code?
In code.
Like what kind of code was it?
Like I've tried actually to, it's like Tigsy or something.
Okay.
I've tried to make figures. There's some like hardcore LaTeX people that write their papers and they use that code, but it is like, it's the worst code to write. Like, it's like really awful. But like it doesn't care, right? It is a master of every single program which ever made, which is pretty wild. And it's able to do that.
By the way, you're like, what is emergence and what it's like. GPT-4 is a pretty good example of emergence, right? Like it's smarter than any one person or any one input that it got, right? We just dumped all of human knowledge, and now it's like magically smarter and better than anything that and it, like to the extent where like the only real way to vet it and test it is to use it, to engage with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that there's even more spicy takes, that there's even like the AGI conversation. I think people move goalposts so fast that they forget. There was a time not very long ago when you say, oh, well, there's no computer that's smarter than a human. And you'd say, well, but a calculator can do like long division way faster than a human. You're like, well, yeah, but that's narrow. That's super narrow abilities. And like even these AIs that can do chess is super narrow. It's like, okay, so now we have a thing that can play chess. It can use tools like calculators, right? And, it has superhuman, like basically name your pick. And I think that people are still having a discussion whether or not that's AGI. I think it's quite general, right? Like,
yeah. And the one of the things they brought up in this this conference, that talk I was telling you about, they were talking about using semantically trained models to assess images and stuff like that. And it's like, oh no, these things that have just been trained on one set of type of data actually seem to perform really well on totally unrelated tasks, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, it was pretty wild.
All right. Well, I think we might be right at time. Critical battery on my Fitbit here.